Good evening, everyone. My name is Jen Gilliman. I'm the interim director of the Boston University School of Visual Arts, and I welcome you to our Spring Contemporary Perspective Lecture Series. For those of you joining us for the first time, this series is a time where we invite renowned artists, critics, and designers to come to campus and to participate and engage with our visual arts community. We are thrilled tonight to have Sheila Pepe with us. After her 1-hour lecture, there'll be time for questions. We ask that you wait to get the microphone before asking your question because the event is being recorded. I've also asked that Josephine Halverson, Professor and Chair of Graduate Studies, introduce our guest tonight. So let me turn things over to Josephine. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here. And it's my great pleasure to introduce Sheila Pepe and welcome her back to Boston. Sheila has her own institutional history here in Boston, having studied ceramics at Mass Art, and then later doing her graduate work at the museum school. She's also exhibited her work twice at the ICA, in 1997 in Gothic, Transmutations of Horror in Late 20th Century Art, and then again, only a few years ago in 2014, in the comprehensive survey Fiber, Sculpture 1960 to the Present. Her work has also been seen at MoMA PS1, the Contemporary Art Museum in Houston, and she's in many other places. She's the recipient of several very prestigious awards, including the Louis Comfort Tiffany Foundation Award and the Joan Mitchell Foundation Award. Sheila, I'm so happy to have her here and I'm so glad she's going to share her work with all of you. She's an artist and also what I would call a communitarian who inspires me and so many others. She's one of the most generous and one of the most engaging people I've ever been lucky enough to meet and to know. And I've also been lucky enough to teach alongside her several years at Yale, where we did critiques together. And in fact, we bumped into each other in the McDonald's parking lot in West Harlem 2 weeks ago when we were both doing visits to the Columbia graduate program in New York. And then, of course, here we are at right here at Boston University. When I was writing this and reflecting on Sheila's visit here, I kept weaving through the ways in which she's defined margins, feminism, queerness, inclusiveness. But yet these terms are not defined in any hard way or by any fast rules. In fact, it's rules themselves that Sheila Pepe teases apart. In a 2014 essay in the Brooklyn Rail, she talks about dealing with rules within art by thinking of them as choices, crafts, and forms to be used as parts of larger languages. So where do we position ourselves at this very moment, here in this auditorium, part of this large and central university here in Boston, one which has celebrated and at times reified the hierarchies within painting, capital P, or sculpture, capital S. For someone like Sheila Pepe, who's explored and constantly shifted the traditional margins of art, craft, the domestic, the outside, the other, the feminine, the queer, what does it mean for her to be taking center stage tonight? Perhaps it is through the very title of this lecture series, Contemporary Perspectives, that we can gain an understanding of the importance of pivoting our priorities, what we think about, how we see the world, and perhaps how we think. So please join me in giving a warm welcome to Sheila Pepe, to gaining insight from her perspective.
Thank you, Josephine. That was amazing. I hope I do a good enough job. No. So let's begin. It's great to be back in Boston. Okay, start. That's my instruction. So for a minute, or perhaps a moment, let's just remember our first encounter with this image and images like it that train us to engage in tricks of the eye and the mind. How many people have seen this one before? A lot of you. Some of you not. So if you look into the picture, you can see one of two characters, a maid, a young maid, who I identify as a Parisian dancing girl. She has a feather at the top of her head. She's turned away 3/4. She has a cute little nose that's kind of peeking out and above her cheek and an eyelash, and she's wearing a kind of fancy costume with a choker around her neck. Do you see her? Okay. Or the crone. She's a little bit harder to see. I would say drawn in a way that is a little bit harder to grasp because some things don't completely add up. But she has a very long nose, and what the choker is now her mouth. And she has a kind of receding, she probably doesn't have any teeth because her jawline does something strange, and her jaw actually sits into big ruffed, maybe a fur coat, and she has a big kind of babushka on her head. Do you see her? She has kind of droopy eyes. All right. So the interest for me in this kind of image is not necessarily the maid or the crone, or even the politics of that image, but in that moment when we can shift from one to the other and even perhaps hold both images in status with each other at the same time. As a young artist, the issues of perceptual ambiguity, tricks of the mind and language, and the eye that kind of mauled our trained expectation and the fixed categories of into like possibilities of more than one meaning at the same time. So picture more than one name, in this case, maid and crone. So early on, my project was to perform this gesture in this kind of very space of action of naming by making. So in this case, objects that are things with no pictures to them, and then to affix a light, randomly creating a shadow, and then automatically, without forethought, drawing into that shadow the first image that occurred to me, an interpretation of that abstract mark. That happened to be a shadow. The way I experienced it at the time in the late 80s and 90s was drawing as naming, that it would pass from seeing to drawing without any language. The works in that case existed only by the virtue of the electrical grid that this light was plugged into, and thereby tapping this colossal infrastructure that supports it, and contingent on a specific piece of architecture that it's attached to and drawn on and therefore appropriated. Altogether, the object, the light, the electricity, and the drawing, all of the parts and the spaces that comprise the whole were built into pulling the viewer in as a participant to experience the kind of buzz of difference, dissonance of difference. So holding that shared difference together in a state of ambiguity. The ambiguity existing between the parts and how they got made and what they actually did and represented, to sort of make sure that the entire operation was completely ephemeral was an added part of the construct to reinforce the idea that this was a brief perceptual moment in time and contingent on all of these parts being in the same time, in this same place with you, or you with it. This is an image of that last piece in full light, and you could see the objects were made, actually, many of the things were made by a simple byproduct of my attention span. 15 minutes, 15 minutes, 15 minutes, 15 minutes accumulated. So that object, which is me casting a wire into the bottom of a dirty coffee cup, and then standing, once it's dried, standing over the garbage can in the sculpture studio, picking up pieces of things that I could use. So that's a discarded piece of rubber, some masking tape, and maybe something else. And then making these shelves and lights, battery operated. You know, if you can imagine, it was Radio Shack was the place I went for everything. And then positioning the little focus light bulb, and once the shadow went up, just drawing right into it. So let's go back to that for a minute. So this idea that it's a one-time operation, never to be realized again in each and exact configuration. The idea was to make sure that the objects accumulated is a singular work and solely about the experience of that momentary perception of dissonant parts, of different parts, tied together by the phenomenon of a simple, seemingly binary juxtaposition of light and shadow. And that I reinforce because the collision of what we assume to be simply binary is quite an exciting place for me. The other part of this work was that it was made to defy ownership, replication, and resale. And that is basic, you know, I would say that those ideas could be put forward because my early adulthood and education happened in Boston, because I understood that there was a market relationship between what we made and our audience. But it was at a time in the 90s that it was very important for me to say that is not the only relationship, and while more conceptually aestheticized works or media works or less formal works, presumably formal works, or gestural works, or idiosyncratic works were being identified as conceptually driven and not aimed at the market. My position was that all of the things that were in a knee-jerk way identified with the market, the individual hand, historically formalist work that had to do with New York abstraction, or work that included things that looked like illustration or were then quote unquote illustrative, were all market commodities and couldn't be considered as properties for conceptual work. There was also this myth going around that conceptual work was not on the marketplace. So for me, it was very important to position this work in all of these difficult reversals of assumptions that I was experiencing in the Boston art world in the 90s. Ironically, the work that these doppelganger pieces began before I came to graduate school. And I had conducted this similar kind of experiment while I was in Western Mass and didn't really know what it was. And it was through the experimentation of all other sorts of things that I came to understand how these parts and parcels could work as one, and weren't, as probably every student fears, a strange-looking amalgamation of personal expression without any legs. So as you can see, the work grew and became a variety of other kind of manifestations, grew to larger statements. And in time, by 1997, which was really only a few years after I started doing this work, I was in an interview and a colleague asked me, how do you keep making this work over and over and over again, and it always goes away, you always destroy it? And basically said, how can you destroy your own work? And my answer was very simply, I grew up in a family deli, where basically my mother made 500 meatballs every Wednesday in this huge pot of what we call gravy and probably what everybody else calls spaghetti sauce. And my dad made just huge vats of potato salad and coleslaw and baked beans and tons of catering jobs that I tagged along with as a small child. And so I had this perfect training to be completely involved in the craft of a valued and loved product made with great care that had an extremely short life and whose end is literally the end. It's not such a happy place. It's not a place we talk about much. Plus, and this realization has only come more recently, I attended a place called St. Margaret's Roman Catholic Church every Sunday, every Friday for confession, and on all holidays until the age of 17, which in New Jersey is the driving age. So you can kind of do the math there about what happened when I got a license. But this is also a place that was deeply immersed in issues of social justice during the 60s and early 70s. The church that I grew up in had this, this is one of the main stained glass windows. This is a predominantly white church that had this wonderful man, Martin Luther King Jr., Tom Dooley, Doug Hammarskjöld, and of course St. Augustine as the main stained glass windows. It's kind of people overlooking us during Mass every Sunday. And so in that church, I learned in a kind of, not such a classical way, but in actually a more kind of progressive way, this idea of transubstantiation, where of course we were supposed to know that the bread literally turned into the body of Christ, which I was always a little bit of a skeptic, but but that this idea of transubstantiation could happen in other ways. And then again, years later, reading Duchamp's Creative Act, where he talks about transubstantiation for the artist, which resonates. But even now, I think that as artists, we engage in physical things in the analog precisely because there is this promise of some type of even secularized transubstantiation. So both institutions set several things. One is standards for service, which, of course, infuses the physical work itself in terms of how I relate to my audience, but also it supports the entire kind of constellation of things that I do, from teaching to visiting to trying to be a citizen and all the things that I think are important to us now, both as artists and as people, one would hope. And that I deeply concerned in being engaged in literal economies of making that have extremely accessible forms as well as extremely arcane bits of information that, there are probably only 4 or 5 people that I can have deep discussions about the nature of one formal move versus another formal move. And I just want to say, every day I remind people, form is content. So there is no separation of these things. There is no separation between content, between meaning and gesture, between content, meaning, and form, and material. So there are no distinctions in this world. There are redefinitions and recategorizations. So seeing, drawing as naming. In different ways, it became clear to me that the power of observation was not only a way to know my work, but it was actually a way to see the world. And as I like to tell my students, my work is always smarter than I am. The work is made, and the digestion of the work and the movements of the work after the fact always teach me more than I knew going into it. Each place has its own vocabulary. But when we listen carefully, often the words have more than one meaning. So this would be an object and a drawing that are contingent, concrete, and ephemeral, abstract, representational, and a picture. A domestic craft process made by an abstract picture that is a window treatment, that is a room divide. Drawings that are objects, contingent objects that are drawings made with light and shadow. Object that is a drawing, a picture, a process, and is ephemeral. Drawings that are works on paper, drawings that are photographs. Drawings that are painterly, which are drawings that are dynamic all over compositions. Contingent drawings that are objects, objects that are automatically made from ready-mades, objects that are automatically made, that are handmade, that identify a family resemblance, and create a dynamic field composition. Objects that identify a family resemblance, that are handmade, and cast from ready-mades. Objects that are ready-made, cast from ready-made, and stands alone. Object made using a domestic craft to make a drawing that is an ephemeral object that casts shadows to make drawings. Object made from ready-mades that is a drawing that is a dynamic all-over field composition made using a domestic craft, made by cannibalizing old work, cutting it apart, and putting it back together. Drawing that is a work on paper, which is made by cannibalizing old work, cutting it apart, and putting it back together. A drawing that is a work on paper, which is made by cannibalizing old work, cutting it apart, and putting it back together, that is a dynamic field composition that has a strong referent. The referent, 9th Street Bridge over the Gowanus Canal in Red Hook, Brooklyn. An object that is made by crocheting shoelaces and rubber bands. An object that is made by knotting rubber bands and is a room divide and a drawing. Rubber bands, picture, painting. Meatballs, video, picture, painting, plaster, shoelace. So, as I've just done, we can collect, present our specific cultural memes, our work, seek through them, through travel and observation of other cultures, and of course download all of these things off the web in a completely ahistorical time. The more we accumulate and remix this information, the more we can assume that they are laid bare and presumably equalized in a new, I use big air quotes, curated collection outside of linear time. This is mostly the culture that we live in now. This is also the promise of some aspects of what we experienced as postmodernism in the 90s, in that it leveled the playing field. It allowed other people, like myself, into the conversation. It allowed us to use what were fairly normative references in new ways. And things got messy, which was probably the best thing that could ever happen. I'm a big fan of an enormous mess. But what we saw and what we see now when the analog ideas became digital, and when access became less physical and more a reflection of ourselves, and less a reflection of possibilities and curiosity, that this holding things outside of linear time is an enormous problem. However, well, that's the however. So we can do it. It's generative. It's generous. It includes new players in the game. It includes the possibility of new games and new ideas about the future. But without histories, without knowledge, verifiable, and I would say without a desire for the objective, even though we're not allowed to have it, without a desire for it, we lay ourselves bare to many possibilities. Displaying memes without context or discourse, we can only assume the role of the tastemaker instead of the meaning maker. We risk inviting balkanization effects of likingness, and in the state of divisions, taste-making helps drive that mechanism called gentrification. It helps drive gentrification, and we might think of it this way. It's a simpler, more domesticated, and more familiar kind of colonization, an update of 19th century carpetbagging and of 20th century redlining. Taste. So, taste is something different than resemblance. I've spoken before about family resemblance. I'm a huge fan of Wittgenstein's idea of family resemblances. And here you see the Pepe family, who I physically hold a great deal of family resemblance with. I have my grandmother's shins and her ankles. Thank God I saw it in my very young niece some 20 years ago and realized I'm not that fat, I just have Pepe ankles. I have the droopy Pepe eye. I look at these people. I did have my grandmother's eyebrows until I was, my dear mother from the other side of the family, Frank is my dad there, was really crazy about plucking absolutely every hair on my face down to basically nothing. And so in some areas there's little at all, and in other areas there's a whole lot more than I expected. But that's okay. Grandma Pepe had a mustache too. So I look like these people, and of course all of us have this thing, you know, where young artists, I think, always want to do something with images of their families. You look at that photograph and you're like, oh my God, isn't that amazing? And then, of course, we realize that everybody just sees like people from the 50s, and that's about it. But what's more important about this photograph than my personal joy of family resemblance is the cultural information in this photograph. Through the clothes of my relatives, I learned something about culture, and that was sitting at their knee. Literally, I spent a lot of time looking at their legs and shoes. I learned that Aunt Annie lives in Florida. Aunt Mary lives in New Jersey, and Grandma Rose spends half of her time in New Jersey and half of her time in Florida, simply by looking at their shoes. That's a sculptural read. It's also a cultural read. Other important facts about my cultural upbringing. I went to the World's Fair with my family, and because we were good Catholics, the first and only that I can remember. We spent a lot of time in the GE section with the enormous car, but the only international pavilion we went to was, guess it, the Vatican, where, didn't think, now that I think about it, I wouldn't have thought international pavilion, but of course they got one. And I saw the Pietà. Now, that was amazing. I saw the Pietà. I have very little memory of the Pietà. I have a very intense memory of holding on to my mother's hand and the cloth of her dress next to my face and riding for the very first time on a moving sidewalk. The Pietà, my mother's dress, a moving sidewalk. Pretty great stuff. I also grew up at a time in New Jersey where we were put on school buses several times a year and taken to New York to go to the Museum of Modern Art, to go to the Metropolitan Art Museum, to go to the Whitney Museum. I also heard Bernstein conduct Peter and the Wolf. We saw at the Met Opera House several operas with this is the best part. The operas were great. I loved the operas. But during scene changes, they left the curtains up and you could see the entire city block of stuff moving about. Amazing. Amazing. I still get like, ooh, verklempt, as we would say about that. But, this piece of work, of course, as an 11-year-old, I didn't really understand. I knew it was enormous. I knew I wanted to play chicken with the guards to see how close I could get. I knew I didn't want to get in trouble that many times, but it happened. But what did I know? I knew that people weren't particularly happy in this picture. There was screaming going on, and so much screaming that the horses were even screaming. And the lady was screaming. The lady's like really upsetting screaming. The lady and the horse and that light bulb, it's doing exactly what it should do for a child. And of course, the monumentality of it was just mind-blowing. It was mind-blowing in a way that for most of my life, I could not project myself into anything that scale. Not until the 90s, not until 1994, when my teachers at Skowhegan said, okay, Sheila, we like the little stuff, but maybe you should make something bigger. I'm like, bigger? No. I'm not into heroics. So I went to art school and studied ceramics. I made things from my dreams when I got there, the work in the back. And when I came out as a lesbian, feeling duped by patriarchy, I worked intuitively from my politics, the work in the foreground. By the time I got out, I had learned to make objects that were abstract, contingent, and metaphoric. I made bricks that I called women. I made that triangular because I was an essentialist feminist. And I set them into a domestic context because the domestic was, at the time in the 80s, the place of the liberating location of women that was first and foremost on the docket so that we could enter the world like everybody else. And I made small drawings that were plans for the migration and reconstruction. They looked like football plan drawings, but they were definitely of these bricks. And after I got out of art school, my dad said, Sheila, you can come home, we'll open a deli together, and when I retire, it'll be yours. This is something his father had done for his brothers. They were opening shoe repair shops, though my dad had to go on his own to open a deli. But he wanted to pass down this tradition to me as the youngest, and clearly the one without any apparent future in his mind. He had no idea what. And so he's offering this, and I said, you know, Dad, I'm in Boston, it's really exciting, and I'm going to be an artist, and I'm fine, I'm going to get work. And then what did I do? I worked in a lesbian separatist restaurant, which was much more the kind of place that I wanted to be. I had all the training I needed to work in a restaurant, and I now had the politics and the self-identification to work in a lesbian separatist restaurant. The funny thing about Beatles was, I don't know if there are any old-timers here who were there back in the day, but there was a moment when the owner, Laura Pattison, said, do you think that we could put an ad in the paper for a new waitress that says, lesbians need only apply? And I said, I actually don't think that's legal. There was a kind of sense of mission and utility, and so I translated my art making into making contraptions that I thought were utilitarian, like holding up the menus that were like always falling on the floor when you, and taking the salt and sugar with them when you put them between the napkin dispenser and the sugar dispenser. Of course, so I put this up, and everybody thought it was like an S&M restaurant now, and I was like, what? It just didn't, it went right over my head, the little Catholic girl, still holding on to some conceits. But you see precursors of formal interests and ways of making connections that would pop up later in my life. And this desire to kind of pull from utility and have function be, utility be kind of a lovely failure. But it was a great time. These are my coworkers, Rivette there at the second table, Margaret, Laura Pattison, Jane Picard. This was a typical after the shift, or perhaps before the shift, everybody getting ready. What did we want? We wanted a place for ourselves. We wanted a place that seems maybe now ubiquitous in I don't know, like what young baristas or old baristas think about the place where they live, but where they work. But it was a restaurant where we wanted to play our own music and be nice to the customers we wanted to be nice to and wear what we wanted to be nice to. It was DIY before DIY was even invented. Most of the women in there were not native to restaurant business. I was one of the few. This is hollandaise instruction. Now I just want you to keep an eye on that dirty elbow. That dirty elbow has been that dirty since probably 1962. It's still that dirty. And there it is again, watching a demonstration of pattern welded steel at Haystack in the summer of 1984. I studied blacksmithing. I liked the heat. I was big on glass and helping out in the glass. Anywhere where there was fire, I was there, both physically and then at a time metaphorically. But in truth, for a while, I made friends. I made work just for my friends, and I kind of eventually quit making art. I quit ceramics after an NCECA that happened right here at BU, saying, all those men want to do is master Mother Earth by making pots out of it. I'm out of here. And then I went on my way and did things like made signs for Mary Daly's group protesting pornography in Harvard Square. And following lectures in Boston, and then later when I moved out to Western Mass, and Audre Lorde was a frequent event that couldn't be missed. Indrid Dworkin, who I heard right here at BU, and of course the local favorite, Mary Daly, who was wonderful but also became very problematic when it came to issues of race and when it came to issues of dogma. I found her writing and her message very inspiring as a young person. But once I got out to Western Mass among some other lesbian separatists and realized that they didn't want me hanging out with my sister because she was straight and perhaps a fembot, the Italian kid just went crazy and started screaming about how, you can't talk about my sister. And so the other problem was that there was no mainstream art that was permissible because it was the art of the patriarchy. And I found that crazy because although I didn't like the patriarchy, I did like their art. And so I had to deal with it, you know? Like years later, I had to deal with the fact that I love Carl André's work. Hard. Did he or did he not kill his wife, Anna Mandiana? I don't know. Did she have a horrible death? Yes. Are things complicated? Yes. Can I hold both these differences together at the same time? I better be able to. So one day, missing mainstream art very badly, I took a job as a gallery guard at the Smith Museum of Art. And then I became a gallery guard and preparedness assistant, and then later I became an administrative assistant and a curatorial assistant. I mean, they just kept moving me around. And the most amazing group of people. They just kept moving me around, and I just kept doing different jobs and adapting and learning. And I did really consider going to museum conservation, going into curatorial things. And at the end of the day, I realized probably when I met, well, a little bit before the time that I met the wonderful woman who made this piece, Nancy Spiro, I realized that I wanted to make art and do curatorial work and do something else. But at the time, it was not a typical thing to do. You couldn't do both in the way that it might be a little bit more plausible now. And so I realized that I was doing things in the studio, but I had no idea what I was doing. And you know, from 1985 to 1993, or 1985 to 1993, yeah, I worked in these museums, both in Western Mass and Boston, and it was an enormous part of my education as an artist. But it was not, in the end, my calling. I needed to know if I could do it. I mean, like most people, you know, art is one of those things where you have to, it's like almost like the reverse of AA. You have to wake up every morning and choose it. Like, not to not do it, but to do it. And there are times when you wake up and you're like, nah. And there were periods of my life, five years, where I was like, yeah, no, don't think so. Or I want to participate in a different way. Or like right now, I don't read much art stuff. It's all world history. It's all trying to get the outer ring in place so that the art history can sit inside of that. Cultural history can sit inside of that. So in '89, I started working again and making things. And in '92, I moved back here to Boston and entered the first year of the MFA at the museum school. So just want to do a sort of little recap to re-enter this section. Observing similarities and shared differences, naming and holding naming at bay. These are very core, consistently core activities in my everyday life, in my studio, in other places. Our work, whatever it is contingent on history. We begin with simple observations like this one, which I could only make after I started crocheting for completely different, well, not for completely different reasons, for equally political reasons, but that had to do with my personal experience as an artist. We find actual precedents for our work, and we make a platform for our own work. Even if we don't do it ourselves, others will inevitably do it for us. And so as artists, we're more empowered to do it for ourselves, acknowledging sometimes the awful truth that somebody has come down this path before, right? I have a great debt to Faith Wilding and her room, because without it, some of the political maneuvers of infiltrating space with crocheting would have not been understood by most people. In 1979, when I was still at Albertus Magnus, the 4-year liberal arts school that I went to before Mass Art, I saw 2 works of art that changed my ideas about everything. This was the first one. This was kind of the no-brainer. This was the crossover hit. You could read about it in the regular newspaper. Judy Chicago's Dinner Party, which I saw once here at the Cyclorama and once in Brooklyn at the Brooklyn Museum. What did I love about this? Well, in 1979, as a little straight Catholic girl who was a budding feminist, I got all of the messages. I understood what a seat at the table was. I understood the aesthetics. It looked like I was going to Mass. I mean, is that not a chalice? That's a chalice. Yeah, I'm not sure that the priest would ever allow the plate on the altar, but on my altar, she's completely welcome. The taste level of Chicago's work and how it situates us in this kind of ecclesiastical language was completely transparent to me. And because of that transparency, I could project myself into the story. I could find myself someday seated around that table. It was also a very exciting history project for anybody, for all of us who didn't know who most of those women were. So it functioned on a very populist level, and in time, I think, would reveal lots of issues about good and bad taste in the art world in 1979. Here's the good taste part of it. I would also skip class at Albertus to go down the street to the Yale Art Gallery, and I would see this, which was on loan for a period of time on the first floor, and I would stare at that thing and get really angry because I had no idea what it was. I just, it took me years to figure out what it was, to be honest. Yeah, it just defied me. I needed more. Through this work, I understood, through my stubbornness, that I needed to learn more about the context to understand what the parts were. That it wasn't just that I liked it or didn't like it. I didn't like it because I didn't understand it. And that was an amazing story. That was an amazing thing for myself. Years later, what I understand about these 2 artists is very clear to me that the one thing that Eva Hesse understood for herself and her work that Judy Chicago would, at least at the time, and I can't claim to know anything now, could not abide and would not abide, is this idea that historically and culturally women have been placed in the canonical role of the contingent being, the perpetual Adam's rib. And so through her gesture out from painting, through her gesture out from traditional means of art making, as a woman and as a practitioner of a kind of invented craft, she could speak of these contingencies in various ways in her work that now are extremely resonant for me in terms of how she participated in a very high-minded game and not in a very populist one. For me, I needed both. In fact, the core idea here that I want to convey is that chronological histories are important, whether we like them or not. We do not have to like the history to accept that it's happened. And as artists, when we don't like the history, we work to rightfully entangle them with new problems. So in my world, Jackson Pollock's paint webs are exactly like that. That is what I like to call lesbian decor. Those are literally webs, Wicca webs, laced with dried flowers and some double axes, Amazon's axes, around the podium of the old Cambridge Baptist Church when Diana Davies took the photograph, when Sonia Johnson came to Boston, to Cambridge actually. If you don't know who this woman was, you should research her. She was my Bernie Sanders. She was the Green Party candidate. She was way left. She had testified. She was an ex-Mormon woman who was cast out of the Mormon church for being a feminist, and she spoke to Congress on behalf of the ERA. This is an equation that every artist wants to make, pulling a culture that is unknown, that is sub, into the main frame. And once it becomes ubiquitous, we get all excited, and once other things get projected upon it, it's a little bit of a downer. But for me, this is the hybridity of making and inserting a voice or a culture into a larger context. So in 2001, the work grew in scale, leading with homecraft and the gesture of taking space with a crochet hook, men's shoelaces, and at times with industrial rubber bands, infiltrating institutional art spaces with a domestic craft. Sometimes the idea is architectural, to camp out in a white box, making sometimes monumental tents within. In my mind, I approach the work from a desire to scribble as if I have that kindergarten blue crayon through this very, 30-foot ceiling space and getting some help to lift 1,700 pounds of nautical tow line into that space. The physical and the optical and the whimsical and the sort of almost, ahistorical nothingness of wanting to scribble in space with a blue crayon, all are tied together by this opportunity to inhabit inhabit the white box for a period of time. Other times, the idea is to line the white walls with shoelaces and black rubber, opening up another tent-like play workspace for the students at UC Santa Cruz. The title of this show is especially important to me and is a kind of lasting title that pops up kind of internally and in dialogues again. Hot Lesbian Formalism. At this very moment at UC Santa Cruz, the word formalism would have never appeared anywhere, but the word hot and lesbian would be ubiquitous. And so my contraction was meant to playfully engage with my audience. In my mind, I'm crocheting urban structures, while also knowing that these fences also read as like ripped lingerie or fishnet stockings, or the formalist drawings that I, in my eye, resolve them to be. The history of formal drawing in the 20th century is the thing that concludes the work, as well as being able to identify the objects as one thing or another. Sometimes it's in response to another artist. This was I was asked to do this piece in response to a piece called Boa that Judy Pfaff did there 20 years earlier at the University Gallery, now I think the University Art Museum. And then there's an arrangement of space to look like subterranean New York in the painting to alter the field of operation graphically and chromatically by painting the floor color up along the wall. And then really getting very involved in filling the space with as much cast orange as I possibly could. This is about as good as it gets for me as a painter. Like, I like to play with color, but I can't make it. I do not know how to make it. So that I can find it. I can sculpt it. And the idea of the structural is very important to me, that the walls become things by binding them, that the ballast is a different kind of drawing, that when you walk in the space, you can sense that there is an impediment. You can't walk through the space, you can only approach it from the stairwells that are similar on either side. So there are years of playing with ideas of painting, of collapsing flatness, and trying to create a kind of opticality on a surface, or attaching things or stretching things onto a surface so that the light, shadow, material, reflection, and some color becomes a kind of physical and graphic event. This all while reading all of Ayn Rand's novels during the Bush administration, thinking this would probably be a good time to do this. Little did I know this would probably be a better time to do this. And so in this case, it's like a grand ephemeral piece. It's all rubber bands. The blue rubber bands go to the school children who are taught by the gallerist's wife. The entire thing gets cut out of the space. And doing this in a commercial space with people who are tolerant for this kind of activity. Feminizing grids of Midtown Manhattan, drawing with tulle. So for 15 years, I made at least 2 large crocheted installations on site each year, all of them designed to be completely ephemeral, with the exception of 4. I still take space in this way. I mean, this piece at the ICA is one of the 4. But I realized that being a feminist and making ephemeral work is probably not a good idea. At the end of the day, you realize that you would like something to last. You would, being completely wiped out of the story is not a good feminist strategy. I should have learned that, but I'm learning it now. So leaning into something more concrete is a little bit more on my agenda, but I still like to play with things. So I'm going to play this video. I'm going to assume that some of the people saw this piece at the ICA. The title of the show was Fiber, Sculpture, 1960 to the Present. What I thought was really interesting about, because my work is always situated in a particular piece of architecture, I found the ICA, I remember the old ICA, so the new ICA is a very distinct object to me. And I found this particular drop atrium space there very strange. It was heroically sized, yet it had no mechanism for lighting it on its own. The most alarming in a good way part of the interior of the space was the moving elevator. I mean, an amazing piece of sculpture on its own, and creating an amazing vista onto the harbor on its own. The interesting thing, though, was that if you were there during the day, you would likely be blinded. So although I believe I verifiably made a piece of sculpture in that it took space, and it worked in space, and it literally moved in space, I know that I really made a drawing because it was predominantly flat, that the only way to see it was from afar, that most of the time the lighting would either animate color or create no color, or, I mean, it was optical. It was an optical experience for most of the time one could enjoy it or see it. At night, maybe it was backlit by things that were going on elsewhere in the museum. Maybe you couldn't see it at all. So my contrariness got embedded in this idea that I would making something other than a sculpture in a sculpture show, and that I could animate what I thought was a kind of silly piece of the architecture. Great, but silly. And so I wanted to be silly too. And so I attached this really raggedy bunch of crocheted, mostly terry cloth and some sparkly bits to the elevator so it would go up and down with you. Kind of elegant, kind of schmata. So that's like the first time I've actually done that piece of the lecture, because I'm figuring you probably know the space, you probably know it well, and we could have a nice conversation about the merits of the public versus the exhibition spaces in that particular institution. Finally, I want to get to a few examples of things that I began to do with others. For example, working with a design studio, Balnogus Architects at PS1, and they said, well, we have to do these seats, and we sort of designed them for architects. It meant that they had like a piece of scrap material, like sitting on a little dollop of something. There were no fabrication designs, there were no imperatives. They just had a basic idea. And so I got to kind of do my thing with them and finally make something that really worked. And I got to watch people use it without looking at it, which was amazing. It was a very great experience. And at the same time, because there were so many people there at the warm-ups and they made everything sag, I could go back in and keep drawing through the course of the summer as I would cinch things up to. So I had my aesthetic joy and my utilitarian dream come true. Later that year, and this very much in the spirit of play, worked to make a three-dimensional drawing with bust lines. I learned what yarn bobbing really was. Yarn bombing is really 9 and 10-year-old boys with a ball of yarn throwing it across the plaza there in front of the Winter Garden, which makes that great mass of stuff. Then curator Elizabeth Dunbar asked me to collaborate with her on a piece at Lawrence Miller's site called Test Site in Austin, and this place was actually a home. And it was an enormous challenge. It's like bringing beans to Boston. My whole shtick is pulling the stuff out of domestic space and putting it in something institutional. And so I really had to ask myself, what was the operation? And for me, it was a move from being more kind of conceptually focused on how things are made and understood to taking a position to kind of retrench myself by holding on to the thread of feminist art and keeping this alive during a period where I felt like it was important. By 2007, when this occurred, WAC Art and the Feminist Revolution exhibition had been mounted, the book had been published, and what I kind of took as an infiltration, its origins had become canonized, and to a degree that I no longer worried about a kind of dissolution of history. And so in keeping with that, I reversed the operation and made work that was specifically designed to be installed as a formal drawing, and then every skein or two attached could be completely unraveled with just a gentle tug, so that people could use the material for their own use, for their own Afghan sweater starts. All the stuff had come from a local supplier. They knew what I had, so if somebody wanted to continue the work, they could go to the local supplier and buy more yarn. They also provided some people to come to the house and give knitting and crochet lessons. So it became this wonderful thing. The goal was to make the drawing that supported the color, there's like a shoelace and rubber band drawing underneath, completely naked. That was my goal for success, was that everything would be taken away. The only place that happened was in Tbilisi in the Republic of Georgia, because the materials were really desired. Not because they they participated and they were wonderful and we all had fun, but at the end of the night when I said, you want more? They were like, yes. So I just stood there rolling up balls of stuff, and at the end of the show, sending it all home with them. And the thing that I loved about the Republic of Georgia is, you see, everybody there knows how to do crafting. This guy is crocheting, they're on a date, the old woman, there are children around doing things. In Europe, this is not, it takes a shape in different ways. My Italian friends who crochet and knit are all older. They're trying to bring really young boys into the operation because they're all like, my daughter who's your age couldn't be bothered doing this stuff. It's too old-fashioned. So it becomes a different kind of cultural interaction and a really kind of investigation of control or loss of control by the artist. I've stopped it for a while, but probably to be continued once I have some new questions. Place. So when space becomes place, this with my friend Diana Puntar and Leah Ganjitano, a participant, old Boston friends, making literally a place, designing a place together for others to perform, scout, to dress up and do disco and enjoy the designs of fashion designers, performance artists, the Shenzhen Sculpture research space, where I've been asked to make a space for people to collect books, videos, for the curators to have programming. Was also an very exciting project locally. Similarly, places to look at my friend Julie Ryan's paintings, Paolo Ferreria's photographs, and Fabiola Mancelli's photographs as well. So why, in a small village in northern Italy, do I want to make like a virgin mantle to celebrate the textile women of that region, and then train it like the Virgin Mary, all around a pair of bloomers made in the 19th century with a kind of radiating blue across the street? Well, you make what you know. Culture's everything you've got, everything you come up with. There is nothing that need be edited out. This blue of this painting came later in life when I became a student of the arts, but as a child, this was the blue that I knew every Sunday morning while I was staring down below the kneeler. I first started in a church like this, but by the time I made my first Holy Communion, I was in a Vatican II Council-inspired church with a floor plan that was a little bit more like this. So decorating for imagined Festival of the Mother, creating out of very horrible synthetic materials that capture the same material sensibility of my Catholic youth is kind of what I'm interested in right now. It's slightly embarrassing. That's good. that's the place we should go when looking to learn new things, where we feel a little bit stupid, embarrassed by the stupidity, and inevitably sort of afraid we'll be shamed for being that stupid. That's where the courage is, I think. And my taste is a little odd and excessive, and I've stolen some funk from my Black American culture makers. I'm completely indebted to many other people who I don't come from. But through it all, I think the questions we are left with are this, not why or necessarily how, but right now, it's more like what if. Because there's no promise in cycling around the same stories. There's no promise in cutting out some of our culture and leaving only other parts of it alive for posterity. It's everything you come with, and that's the end of the talk. So it's a little long. It's a little long. Hi.
Thank you. That was just so generous and so
Thanks.
wonderful.
But I love the questions if you still have time.
Oh, absolutely. I just wanted to ask the folks with the microphones to please come to the front, and we'll open things up for questions. Are these questions or stuff?
You can ask me anything, truly. I'll tell you if I don't want to know it. I will probably answer all questions. So,
I was wondering if you could, right at the end, you were talking about stupidity as sort of something to run towards, and talking in a university where stupidity is sort of against one's survival instinct in terms of this context. How do you?
Yeah.
Well, I'd just be curious to hear more about it.
Yeah, I mean, I'm assuming, as myself, everybody is really interested in learning things and growing and teaching, right? Sharing. So that's a given. I hope I made that clear. But when we get to a point where we think we know things, we hide our stupidity because we're ashamed of it, because we think we have to know all that so quickly, or because we just want to get to the end of the story and know the answer. Or there's so many reasons why the kind of educational system of my youth doesn't exist anymore. And many of those are cultural. But I get the sense that it's not okay to have big questions right now. It's not okay to not know the answer. And it's not okay to pursue education simply for the sake of being slightly less stupid. And you have to be able to do that, to be able to pursue something to be slightly less stupid, you have to first and foremost say, yeah, I don't know. When I was in graduate school, the first year, my most frequently answered statement was, I don't know, because I literally didn't know. But it set me up to have people direct me and in different paths and help me. That's the other thing. I learned to ask for help. I didn't know that was a possibility either. So, yeah, the acknowledgement of, also, like in the past year, I realized that I came to Boston because my mother was a great Italian assimilationist, and she wanted me to get as American as possible, as quickly as possible. And what I realized after the fact is she also wanted me to get as white as possible, as quickly as possible. And this was her dream for me, even though she hated having me away from home. But, the issue of whiteness is something as a person that I am needing to educate myself about and feel extremely stupid about and get myself in really big trouble with people I truly care about. But we have to soldier on. Things don't get fixed unless you admit that you don't know stuff. art doesn't get made unless you say, I don't know something and I want to find the answer. So that's my it's my extremely serious answer.
Just jumping off, thanks so much for the talk, it's amazing. Jumping off of Jaya's question about, about stupidity and your response. You wrote that amazing piece in the Brooklyn Rail about art education today. I think 20 different thoughts about it or so that everyone should read. But in thinking about that, what you just said rings so true, that it's not a moment of where asking questions is encouraged, but having answers, or everyone's kind of looking for success instead of failure. What do you think? What do you think the cultural conditions are that have made this moment come to be, and what hope do you have for those of us who are actually more questioners than answerers?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, it's just I can't help. This is what I just can't help myself say things that are sometimes indelicate, and it doesn't always feel good when you're. I mean, like literally, sometimes it hurts, emotionally upsetting. But I think we've lost track of an ability to do things that are emotionally upsetting. I mean, we're become so tender, and then also so harsh with each other's tenderness that we're in this scramble, it's kind of chicken and egg thing of like, what do you do first? So there has to be more small group, one-on-one dialogue around being honest with each other, simply being honest with each other. Simply saying, you know what, I don't know this, or I do know this, I can help you. Just trade, like skill sharing. I mean, I think it has to happen on a small interpersonal. I think it's important for people to say when they're bored or when they don't want to do something. I mean, constantly asking my students if they're overworked, if they're getting sleep, if they have time to work, even if they're the slowest workers in the world. I'm like, that's what we got. We got slow working and boredom and unmotivated. So it's like, let's just solve this problem instead of telling you why you're an idiot because you have this problem, right? It's just kind of like start with, it's like opening up the fridge and saying, what do we got? I'm not going to starve. Damn straight, I'm not going to starve. Look at me, So it's just being honest with each other, and then asking us what we want. A lot of people I know, a lot of young people I know, I think don't really know, haven't been given the time to sit down and say, oh, this is what I really want, or I don't know what I want. I just need to do some things sequentially that are not necessarily academic or professional. I mean, I spent like 9 years in between being very productive, learning some things about where our food comes from. I learned how to paint a house, I learned a lot of skills, all of which are applicable to life. I met a lot of people I would have never met, different people, way different. I would have never met these people, ever. Some extremely conservative, some I thought were extremely conservative that weren't at all. So life, like I feel sad for everybody born since the mid-'80s. Sorry, but that you're on this like collision course with prosperity that seems imagined by another generation. You have to imagine what prosperity looks like to you. And my guess is it's not necessarily money that you'll keep a roof over your head, or you'll have as much affluence as you want by the choices you make. But you got to turn this thing on its head, or we won't be able to help you. That's a long answer, but, and it's time. It takes time. I work very, very fast as a person in a restaurant. I was brought up to work really fast, and then I realized as an adult, it's like, I literally cannot think that fast. I can do like aped routines fast. You know, I can make fast eggs, or I could at one point in time. But things do take time. And you have to get in touch with that. Anyway.
I have a question.
Yeah, where are you? Okay.
Hi.
Hey.
Well, first, I just wanted to say you do an amazing job at finding a way to create a space while, quote unquote, taking it up. And it's so generous and incredible to see, so thank you for that. But then I wrote down a question. Do you find the move from the ephemeral to the permanent a natural transition or a necessary responsibility?
What was the first word?
The transition from the ephemeral to the permanent.
Yeah, what was the first word?
Do you find the move from the ephemeral to the permanent a natural transition or a necessary responsibility as
That's
an
a great
educator?
question.
Or
I don't feel like it's unnatural. I mean, the forms of kind of evolved to be more simply constructed. I mean, in the past, I would be like, wow, that's a great HVAC system. Let me wrap a ton of stuff around that so you can tell that you got to cut it out. You know, I was like, yay. Now I'm like, whatevs, you know, done that. Now I know what that is. It is a responsibility in a way. I finish things differently. I sew parts in. I think about, I mean, a big part of the ephemerality of the earliest work, the doppelgangers, is because I had studied conservation and because I was unhappy with my own peers who were making things they knew would not last. And they were like, F it, let them take care of it. And I'm like, that's not nice. Like, it's a team effort. It's a reciprocal thing. You know, if you want it to last, make it to last. There are a million things you can do to make that happen. So it began with saying, no, I don't want it to last. Let's make sure it doesn't last. And then it was so many of the other things I talked about. And I have to say the most important part of it that I didn't talk about is that it was economic. There was a period of time where I would get lots of really cool gigs and just enough to kind of buy one new material, because the economy of it was really small scale, mom, and like just clearing, just staying afloat. Like not a lot of money, just staying with a roof and a studio. So I would bring back the other stuff and use it like a sourdough. You know, like start it up and then add one more material. It was like, yeah. Like that blue toe line went a million places before it ended up at Smith. So the second part of it, the kind of responsibility to the work now is saying, I will make it last, and I will also have the kind of business sensibility that I will also invest in the time and effort to see that this thing has a good home. Rather than being more of a performative artist, then I have to kind of look to the marketplace as a different kind of investment on my part. That's the part, I would rather be in a studio with you guys or here talking about stuff than be at a cocktail party. It's just my way. I'm not that, as you could tell, I'm not a big small talker. So it's there are new challenges, which is why I like it. And I feel like a bigger grown-up every day. Like, wow, that's a grown-up thing to do. So that's a great question. Thanks for reminding me.
Hey, Sheila. Thanks for a really subtle and layered account of your work. I'm wondering if you could say, it's kind of coming off of some of the things you were just talking about, a little bit more about how you deal with labor and time and process. And
Yeah.
I'm just, you were talking at the beginning about at one time having had a fairly short attention span. And as you've moved from more ephemeral works to more permanent works in your career, have you had to readjust the way you invest time in the process? Because some of these are very labor-intensive projects you've been showing us.
Yeah. Well, can you hear me? Is this miking me everywhere? I'm not using, okay, so I can change, I can look at you? That's great. Well, it's interesting because that first 15-minute equation became very apparent to me when I would be like, what time is it? Early in my graduate life, and then later when I got to go to Skowhegan, where it was like, there's really nothing else you do except for your chore and be in this little room and go get fed 3 times a day. It's kind of like a miracle. That I would lose myself in the tasks, like when I was a kid, would lose myself like raking leaves, or I would just go off. And I learned how to work on literally several different things simultaneously. So there's something always unfinished. And when I lost my attention or an idea where to proceed with one thing, I'd literally get up and walk over here and start working at something else. And I still do that. And that is less about having any attention span. It's more about having the kind of attention span that I know I need to have to do the work, which is it was probably the same condition I had before, but I didn't understand it as a younger person. Like, I can watch TV for 10 hours, but I'm not paying attention the entire time. When I know I can pay attention to a screen, I watch a foreign film because I'm having to pay attention and read at the same time. And that's how I know I'm there, because I'm getting the entire story, right? So it's something similar. Plus, I grew up in this very kind of workshop-y kitchen thing where there are simultaneous things going on at the same. It's just the way one works. So they're long projects, but small scale at every kind of workbench. Yeah. And then the other part of it is for the installations. When I get to a work site, otherwise called a museum or a gallery, I really like, because of my museum experience, I really like to see, like, what time does the crew go in? What time do they leave? How does this operate? Who takes care of this? Like, knowing what the registrar does, what everybody's job is really meaningful to me. That I'm like, I'll FedEx as much stuff as we can instead of, art shipping it. Art shipping, it's like, really? Only if somebody else owns it. If I own it, FedEx. Let's keep it down and dirty and close to the ground and feeling very accessible and like any other kind of work. It's really, my parents didn't, my dad died after my mother, and he was kind of like, I don't know what you do, Sheila, but I'm glad you're happy. It's like, you're okay? I'm like, I'm okay. Yeah. Thanks, Greg. One last crazy question, or not so crazy question.
Right here. Molly.
It's like Old Home Week.
You led into this one, I think, when earlier you talked about how feeling stupid, but then the other emotion you mentioned was embarrassment.
Yeah.
And then I had a separate question, which now I realize might be more connected than I intended, which is that the fact that you showed that photograph of your family and you're sharing with us the read of it as if you were looking at a picture of a family you may or may not have had dinners with, and in addition to the meatballs and the deli and the shoelace connection, I lose that sometimes with your work, and I love your work, and I'd like even more hearing you talk about other people's work, but that personal side, that connection, but also just you looking at your family and the things that we all see about our identity or embarrassment or them trying to figure out what it means to be an artist.
Yeah.
I'd just love to hear more about that. It's a topic I haven't
interesting.
heard you talk about.
There's a part of me that it thinks about eliminating that from the talk completely, or you gave me a great idea, just using somebody else's family or somebody else's history or like a parallel, because the point is not that the point is to show students how one gathers things from the culture they grew up in to make art, and how you find the connections after the fact often. And if you allow it to happen and you don't bring the man into the room too early to say, no, not that, right? That's too nerdy or old-fashioned or silly or ugly or whatever, right? So I don't mean it to be like the Sheila Pepe show, but I do mean it to be like unusual examples of moments in history and readings of things that you might not think go together, or, when you're a kid and you say, it's a good example. I curated the show down in New York that was a little spot when I first got there. It was called My Mother's an Artist. And my mother was an artist, but she wasn't an artist. She was a Sunday painter, and liked to say that she wasn't an artist. She was a wife and mother, and she painted. Like, that's what I was supposed to do. But I was talking to a friend and said, yeah, my mother's an artist. And then I looked at her and I said, yeah, no, she's not an artist. Like, my idea of what an artist was had changed over whatever it was, 40 years. And realized that there was this whole slew of artists' mothers who were both completely amateur and completely professional mothers, artists. So it was like Linda Benglis and her mom, and Polly Apfelbaum and her mother and grandmother China painters, like crazy. So all the children were artists in some place in their life, and the mothers were professional or not. That's the kind of thing that I think is really interesting, where you look at these either hidden histories, or you start thinking about, well, why does that exist? How does that happen? How can all of these histories be happening simultaneously, kind of thing? And how do we extract different cultures from that experience? So, yeah, you've got me thinking. I might start a talk with other people's histories as an example of what I'm talking about, so that it doesn't become this kind of like individual thing, heroic individual thing, which is not my meaning. Yeah, I think you guys know what I mean. It's like, yeah. Anyway, thank you.
Thank you. It's so beautiful.